Yeah, that's why. It's like just I participated in it.
All right. Good afternoon, or good morning, everybody. Welcome to the House Environment and Transportation Committee and House Health Committee joint briefing on, I'm just going to say PFAS. I'm not going to try to pronounce it as I don't want to embarrass myself too badly. We have a number of witnesses and only a limited amount of time, so let me turn it over to Chair Bagnall to see if she has anything she wants to say at the top.
I just want to say thank you for inviting us, and we are here to listen, learn, and I will ask my committee to adhere to our normal committee rules of one question, one answer, not one question, one answer per panel.
Well, that sounds pretty good to me. Is that an option on this side too? We will start with the Maryland Department of Environment for a PFAS overview. We have some great reps from the department here. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairs Corman, Bagnall, Vice Chairs Guyton and Cullison, distinguished members. For the record, I am Zachary Schaefer, Assistant Secretary at the Maryland Department of the Environment. I joined MDE just over a year ago. Prior to that, I served as Director of Policy at the EPA's Office of Water, where I worked on many issues related to public health and our environment, and in particular, helped to lead EPA and federal efforts to address PFAS. Okay, slides are working. That work gave me a deep appreciation for how complex PFAS issues are and how essential it is that we address them in ways that are effective, affordable, and practical for state and local governments. And I can tell you firsthand that Maryland is leading with that mindset. So what are PFAS? PFAS, which stand for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, I promise that is the last time I will say that today, are a very large family of about 15,000 chemicals. They were invented in the 1940s and have been used widely because they are so useful. They are the active component in many nonstick coatings, waterproof clothing, and stain-resistant carpets. Some of them are critical to life-changing and life-protecting products like firefighting foam, medical devices, and semiconductor manufacturing. They resist heat, water, oil, and degradation in extreme conditions. However, that same resistance means that they don't break down in the environment, and many of them accumulate over time in our bodies. According to the CDC, nearly every American, and likely almost all people around the world, now have some PFAS in their blood. Now, this slide has a lot going on, which is kind of the point. PFAS are a complex problem with many sources and many ways that they get into and move through the environment, and a wide variety of tools we have or need to address them. We have industrial facilities that use PFAS, and it can be released in air emissions and water discharges. It's been used for decades in fighting certain types of fires, so it can be found in high concentrations near airports, military bases, and firefighting training centers. Certain PFAS are active ingredients in dozens of pesticides used on crops, and because they are in countless products that we throw away, it ends up leaching out of landfills. And wastewater systems are also receiving PFAS from residential sources, from you and me, when you shower off your water-resistant sunscreen or streak-free cosmetics or launder stain-resistant shirts and waterproof jackets, it goes down the drain. From there, they get into the soil, into the air, and into our rivers and groundwater. Let's talk about how people get exposed and what that means for human health. These chemicals are used so widely, and because they get into the environment and don't break down, we start to come into contact with them through a lot of different ways. You can drink it, you can eat it, you can breathe it, you can absorb some PFAS through your skin. Of course, drinking water is one of the primary routes of exposure simply because everyone has to drink water. Nationally, EPA estimates that the 2024 drinking water rule will reduce PFAS in the water of 100 million people around the country. But people may also be exposed through eating food that was grown near facilities that make or use PFAS, potentially where pesticides made of PFAS have been used on fields, or by eating products impacted by sewage sludge-derived fertilizers contaminated by PFAS. People are also exposed through contact with products in their homes or at work. It's worth noting that of the PFAS that have been extensively studied, how toxic they are and how they harm people can vary a great deal. But we do know a lot about certain PFAS, like PFOA and PFOS, and we know that repeated exposure over time, even at extremely low levels, has been proven to significantly increase the risk of cancer, heart disease, infant mortality, low birth weight and fetal developmental issues, high blood pressure in pregnant women, and reduced effectiveness of vaccines in children. At the federal level, EPA and other agencies have taken a wide range of important steps and made real progress. You see here things like the drinking water and Superfund regulations and significant funding. We are seeing some signaling of rollbacks from EPA under the new administration, including parts of the drinking water rule and reduced funding for Department of Defense cleanups. But we're also seeing them stand firm in other areas, like on the Superfund rule, so it's an interesting mixed bag at this point. Now, these chambers have also been very busy working on this issue, and that's in great part thanks to your leadership, Chairs Corman, Chairs Bagnall, Vice Chairs Guyton and Cullison, and many others in this room. The George Walter Taylor Act in 2022 directed MDE and other agencies to develop a state action plan, which we delivered in 2023. The last few years have seen bills to phase out some early categories of products that may contain intentionally added PFAS, including firefighting foam. And critically, there were laws to begin addressing PFAS from industrial discharges. There was activity in the Assembly last year on PFAS and pesticides and biosolids that both were withdrawn, and we know that there are several bills coming this year. I'm just going to return to this slide briefly to highlight how we are using our authorities, some state, some federal, now in Maryland to combat these chemicals. At the bottom, you see our general framework for addressing PFAS, which is to, 1, get upstream, prevent them from getting into the environment in the first place. 2, reduce high-risk exposures like drinking water, fish consumption, and contamination on farms that can get into our food supply and impact farm workers. And 3, to hold polluters accountable, make sure that the people who have contributed most to these challenges stop and help pay for fixing them. You see a few color-coded boxes. Green is where we are really out in front, where we've made tremendous progress, things like drinking water from public water systems, water quality monitoring, and providing actionable information to people who catch and eat fish in our waters, something obviously of critical importance to the state and to the Bay economy. Yellow is where we have some strong authorities and are leveraging those to make real progress. These are areas where I'm optimistic that we will have the data and foundations to build upon soon, though there's still much work to do. And orange are those areas, biosolids, more product phase-outs, private wells, pretreatment programs, where additional stronger authorities and more tools would be important to accelerate our progress. I'll very briefly cover drinking water. This is an area where I'm proud to say Maryland shines. In 2024, EPA promulgated national limits for 6 PFAS in drinking water from public water systems. Over a period from 2024 to 2029, the rule will require monitoring, notifications to customers where PFAS levels exceed the federal limits, and requires that systems take steps to meet those limits by 2029, though the current EPA may push that date back by 2 years. Even before federal rules were finalized, MDE worked with public water systems across the state, which serve nearly 90% of households and businesses, to conduct early testing. This means that we knew early which systems would likely need to lower PFAS levels and comply with those federal rules. We know the 64 systems serving 200,000 households that will need to bring those levels down. That early action has set us up to help nearly half of those systems secure more than $90 million to pay for upgrades to treat for PFAS, and we're working with the remaining systems to align needs with available funding. We are confident that we are on track to ensure that community water systems are in full compliance with the federal rules by the original 2029 deadline, regardless of EPA's rollbacks. And this map just briefly shows the areas where we have surveyed and conducted that monitoring in systems. The gray are public water systems where there are no detections. The purple shows those 64 systems and service areas where we do have detections of PFAS above the federal limits. The George Walter Taylor Act set in motion some of the most significant actions that we are taking today, and that begins with ending the use of aqueous film-forming foam called AFFF for testing and training in Maryland at the beginning of 2024. AFFF is one of the largest sources of one of the most dangerous PFAS, PFOS, and thanks to EPA and DoD scientific collaboration, airports, fire departments, and the military are in the process of transitioning to PFAS-free alternatives. Maryland's law establishes and at least partially funds a take-back program enabling MDE to support municipal fire departments in removing and safely destroying their unused stocks of foam concentrate. We've surveyed fire departments statewide and are aware of a total inventory of roughly 10,000 gallons of the concentrate ready for removal and destruction. We did run into some procurement challenges along the way, but we are confident that we are on the cusp of reissuing an invitation for bids, and we'll have this program up and running very soon. Now, eliminating PFAS from our products and processes wherever feasible is one of the most important steps we can take to tackle PFAS. Keeping it out of contact with our food and water, out of our landfills and wastewater, and reducing its use in manufacturing to begin with is almost always the most effective and affordable way to reduce PFAS exposure and risk. Early efforts by this assembly, championed by many of the leaders here in this room, focused on intentionally added PFAS in food packaging, rugs and carpets, some cosmetics, and in 2024, added playground surface materials. We've made notifications to industry about these requirements and anticipate proposing regulations later this year to strengthen definitions, compliance, and enforcement. Zooming out, here's a chart showing the universe of states working on this and the types of products that they are tackling. It may not be possible to eliminate PFAS from all products because they are in some cases essential in certain medical applications, pharmaceuticals, computer chip manufacturing, or space exploration. But there are many much more common products, things that come into contact with our bodies on a daily basis, which contain intentionally added PFAS. And for many of these products, there are PFAS-free alternatives, or the PFAS are simply non-essential to begin with. Maryland has already made a strong and early start on several categories, and other states are building on that progress. You see here that many states are addressing added PFAS in children's products like diapers, cream, and toys, personal care products like dental floss and soap, clothing, feminine hygiene products, and cookware. Some states have created tiered approaches with some phase-outs, some disclosure and labeling requirements. Some are focused on specific categories. Some are pursuing an approach of everything unless it's exempted, which is also a strategy that the EU is considering. We've learned a lot from these states' experiences about some of the implementation challenges and where to really focus our efforts and resources to maximize protection and to minimize disruption to our lives and economy. Let's talk about source trackdown. One of the priorities in our state action plan is to identify where PFAS is already out in the world impacting people and the environment. To do that, MDE is implementing a two-prong investigation framework. Where we already know that there are PFAS in drinking and surface waters, we're working to identify those sources of that contamination so that we can contain it and ultimately mitigate it and hold the polluter accountable. And where we know or suspect there is PFAS use or storage, we are investigating if PFAS have been released into the environment so that we can again contain it and mitigate it and hold polluters accountable. This past summer, MDE conducted a survey of PFAS levels at 120 surface water locations across the state to gauge ambient levels by watersheds and further support these trackdown efforts, and we're currently evaluating that data. Now let's talk about wastewater. I want to be very clear. Wastewater treatment plants are essential partners in protecting human health and proud stewards of the environment, and that's why I've been proud to work on this issue over the last many months alongside MAMWA and representatives from the wastewater industry in the state. Like all of the waste that they handle, including human waste, treatment plants do not create the contaminants in their waste streams, but they do receive them and have to figure out how to either treat them or prevent them in the first place, whether it's E. coli, mercury, lead, or arsenic, and increasingly PFAS. MDE has sampled for PFAS at more than 100 treatment plants, and 34 of them are developing source tracking plans. Implementing the 2024 Industrial User Bill, MDE this December published action levels for PFAS in the effluent of significant industrial users. Based on this first phase of investigations, that means that 7 industrial facilities around the state that currently discharge into plants like Back River, Patapsco, and Piscataway, WSSC's plant, will have to develop mitigation plans and bring those PFAS levels down. One of the things I'm excited about as we look to the future is several tools coming together. The 2024 legislation gave us a really important start, helping us establish action levels and setting up the framework for a collaborative, not punitive, approach to reducing PFAS levels through source trackdowns and mitigation plans. The Federal Clean Water Act establishes what's called a pretreatment program, which gives strong delegated authorities and enforcement tools to most wastewater systems in Maryland or to MDE for smaller ones. The program allows treatment plants to say to dischargers, hey, we have to meet certain state and federal requirements, so you've got to clean up your act. Or, hey, restaurant, you can't just dump fat and grease down the drain and have it block the whole system. Or, hey, chemical facility, you can't just throw explosives in the sewer. We use the pretreatment program every day to get at problematic substances in wastewater, but we largely haven't done it for PFAS yet. That is changing in some cases thanks to the 2024 legislation, but there are still a wide range of potential PFAS dischargers, including some flagged to us by industry, who aren't fully covered by that bill. And while action levels provide some foundation for action, they are not standards and do not fully activate the Clean Water Act's pretreatment program to address PFAS. This is an area where additional standards and requirements would actually empower wastewater systems to compel PFAS dischargers to take corrective action. I'll just briefly share an example we have from looking at Michigan, which launched a program to do exactly this in 2017. Critically, they set mandatory standards that fully activated their pretreatment and local limits programs, which required those dischargers to treat at the source or find alternatives to PFAS. It shifted the burden and the cost of action from the wastewater treatment operator and the ratepayer to the entity using and discharging PFAS. Michigan has seen PFAS load reductions of as much as 99% using this strategy, and they did it without building massive, expensive PFAS destruction systems at wastewater treatment plants. And that's the lesson I see here. Effective source control works, and it's something that Maryland can replicate through collaboration and well-designed standards and regulations. Now, an issue that we know has gotten a lot of attention in Maryland and in this assembly, and where we know a bill is coming this year. Wastewater plants generate sludge, the thick or semi-solid byproduct of the treatment process. It won't stop, it's gonna keep coming, and it has to go somewhere. That sludge is either usually landfilled or better, treated to meet criteria established by EPA into a type of nutrient-rich fertilizer called biosolids. In many states and around the world, this is beneficially used on agricultural land, golf courses, and parks. And this management approach is good. This is the circular economy that we all want. It has greenhouse gas reduction benefits. It provides a valuable low-cost product for farmers. And when done properly, it is safe. But remember, PFAS end up in our wastewater. They don't break down. They accumulate over time, and that includes on farm fields. So they present a real challenge for this program. EPA published a draft risk assessment in early 2025, which evaluated several theoretical but very possible scenarios of PFOA and PFOS contamination in sludge and what happens when it gets used as fertilizer. That assessment found that over time, PFOS and PFOA contamination made its way into dairy products, eggs, meat, nearby drinking water wells, and streams and ponds used for fishing, and that the additive risk of cancer and other health effects exceed EPA's acceptable risk levels by several orders of magnitude. Depending on the assumptions you use, that's hundreds to thousands of more cases of cancer per million people. The Assembly's 2024 PFAS bill established mandatory testing for PFOA and PFOS in biosolids that are used as fertilizer. We also published voluntary guidance in 2024 recommending reduced rates of application. But we need to do more to protect our drinking water sources, our land, our farms and farm workers, and all of us who consume products raised on those farms. Just briefly, I'll note that we have 500 samples now from that data set, from big systems, little systems, rural systems, urban systems. It's a good data set. And what I take away from it is that the vast majority of Maryland wastewater systems that land apply biosolids have comparatively low levels of PFAS. Would I like them to be lower? Sure. But they're not the lowest hanging fruit when we talk about reducing people's exposure. What we do see are a handful of plants, about half a dozen, that, based on our 2025 data, are near to or exceed the levels being discussed for legislation. This is a universe we can wrap our arms around. This is a universe that, with the right authorities and tools, MDE can support them in using those local limits to stop much of the PFAS before it gets into their systems. This is far more cost-effective for everyone. It's far more efficient than trying to remove PFAS from the whole diluted volume of sludge when it gets to the plant. And it's fair. It puts the burden of reducing contamination on those who generate it, or it incentivizes alternatives that don't contain PFAS in the first place. And this is the second. It's a lot of rows of data, so that's the second piece of it. All right, we are almost done. Maryland, through my department and the Attorney General, is actively working to hold the manufacturers of PFAS accountable for their contamination and to help pay for the cost of cleanup in the state. Currently, we are involved in 2 high-profile litigations with the manufacturers. One is a statewide case against several chemical manufacturers, and one is a multi-district litigation specifically addressing contamination from the firefighting foam we discussed earlier. There's not much more we can say on that right now, but I'm happy to refer questions to the AG's office as people have them. Finally, I'll mention funding. Addressing PFAS does take resources. We were fortunate that the 2021 federal infrastructure bill included more than $10 billion nationally in grant funding dedicated to addressing PFAS, and Maryland has leveraged its allotment of those resources strategically. Those funds are administered in Maryland through MDE's Water Infrastructure Finance Administration and are eligible for a wide range of drinking water and wastewater treatment efforts. More than $115 million alone is going to PFAS drinking water treatment here in the state, and approximately $10 million has been committed to a wastewater pilot project. Unfortunately, this is the last year of that federal grant funding, but the state revolving loan funds we administer will continue to be a source of low-cost capital for water systems on into the future. So, some key takeaways to wrap things up. Maryland is among the leading states, and one of the things that I think is a hallmark of our approach is that we are taking a balanced, evidence-based approach to PFAS action. I think it's also important that we come to terms with the fact that it's unlikely we will be able to eliminate PFAS in the environment and society entirely. The goal must be strategic reduction of exposure and risk. It's also important to remember that PFAS can be prevented and removed and destroyed. They are not truly forever chemicals. There is hope at the end of this tunnel. We just have to act smartly. That said, stopping PFAS at the source is generally the most cost-effective and most effective long-term management strategy. One of the things that I saw at the federal level and see every day at the state level is that success requires collaboration across agencies, sectors, and jurisdictions, and that is exactly what we are doing at MDE. Significant work is already underway to identify sources, but more federal and state authority is needed to support load reduction and to hold polluters accountable. Finally, I'll just leave you with the fact that PFOA and PFOS are where we are now. That's 2 of the 15,000 chemicals. This journey is not over. I know that this can feel like Groundhog Day or like we're moving the goalposts all the time on PFAS. Why are we coming back and talking about this session after session? It's because we keep learning more, because we keep doing more, and as we do more, we will learn more, and that cycle will continue. And so we appreciate the attention and the focus from these chambers, from our stakeholders, from local jurisdictions, from advocates and everybody, as we all work collaboratively to understand what to do now and what to do next and how to really develop a long-term strategy that addresses this on into the future. With that, I will turn it back to the chairs, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Great, thank you so much. As we turn to questions for this panel, just a reminder, we have 2 other panels to follow, and we are being evicted from this room at 12:30, so just keep that in mind as you're asking that one question Chair Bagnall has granted you. Madam Chair, I'll let you call on your members.
All right, we'll start with Delegate Kaufman.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to ask you a question. You mentioned that PFAS was in everyday items such as diapers, creams, eggs, and meat and milk. And if I'm a parent out there listening, is there any way for me to tell that there is certain, like how much PFAS a product has in it, so I can purchase products that have diapers, for example, that have less PFAS, or eggs or meat that have less PFAS? I'm just trying to think, if I'm out there listening, is there anything that I can do to be a smart, educated consumer to protect my family in terms of figuring out how much PFAS is in various everyday items?
Thank you for that question, Delegate. It's a great question, and it's a really tough one. So we are, as I mentioned, we are still in a mode of learning more. We are still grappling with understanding where PFAS are used and what types of products, at what levels, and which of those PFAS, are harmful and which of those are more harmful, which of them are less harmful. The short answer is that there is not a national comprehensive labeling program or product testing program. There are states like Maryland, like California, New Mexico, Minnesota, Maine, Colorado, and many of those that I put up there, who are creating PFAS phase-outs or bans, who are creating labeling requirements. There are an increasing universe of products that are labeling PFAS-free. There's a lot of nuance to that. They use some creative terminology at times. They might say PFOA-free, but that's only one of the 15,000 PFAS. So the short answer is we're making progress in that, and when I say we, I mean society writ large, industry writ large. Certain major manufacturers have made big commitments to eliminate intentionally added PFAS in their product lines, even before state or federal bans are taking place. But no, it's an area where there's a lot of progress to be made. What I do want to remind folks is that this is not an acute risk like it's not like drinking an acute poison where you get exposed once and that results in serious health effects. It's about repeated exposure, even at very low levels. So everything that we can do to reduce exposure and reduce risk reduces risk. And so I'm happy to talk more about this. I know time is limited, but this is an area for further work by this body, but many others beyond the scope of Maryland government.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Guyton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here and for the amazing work that you all have been doing over the past several years, particularly to address our community water supplies and wastewater plants. Thank you so much for that. It's really important. A lot of us, however, have districts that are served by wells, private wells, and that wasn't something that I really heard you address much. What does the evidence say about the state of our state's wells, and are there any efforts in place to monitor or to educate folks who are on private wells about this issue and how they could alleviate it?
Thank you, Vice Chair Guyton, and thank you for your leadership on this issue, including with the product phase-out bills that you've worked on and championed. This is a really tough question, and this is one that keeps me up at night because private wells are not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act like community water systems are. So in terms of having regular monitoring data, having requirements like the drinking water rule that applies to community water systems does not extend to private wells. Now, the science extends, obviously. The science on those health effects applies no matter where you get your water from. There are steps that we are taking at MDE to investigate and track down sources, like I shared, where either we know that contamination has occurred or where we suspect that contamination may have occurred, and where in certain of those places where we have found significantly elevated levels of PFAS, there are efforts to make sure that people are aware. We have a guide for private well owners on our website that includes information about the risks, information about treatment options, and then there are some litigations underway that I can't speak to that start to address who should pay for those kinds of solutions, on behalf of impacted households. But this is an area where more investigation is needed, where more resources are needed, and in particular, the funding sources we have in the state of Maryland are directed at community water systems. They are not really eligible for private wells, with some few exceptions where you're connecting wells to a community water system. So this is definitely an area where further progress is needed, and we welcome that conversation.
Delegate Hutchinson.
Hey, good morning, Zach. So last year, a number of us in this committee worked on a PFAS and pesticides bill, which eventually got passed out of the House unanimously, and was based upon a 2-carbon definition consistent with the EPA's definition. You're talking about PFAS in biosolids here today. That's different than the PFOA and the PFOS that you're referring to in the biosolids.
Or the pesticides is different than what we're referring to in biosolids? Yes, we're referring to PFOA and PFOS specifically, and there's not we're referring to those two specific PFAS, not to the whole class of PFAS, and there's not I know that there was a lot of debate over the definition used last year. That's not really part of this bill, because this bill is specifically addressing just those two specific PFAS.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Delegate Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Assistant Secretary. Thanks very much for your presentation. Looking at your biosolid samples for, I guess, 50 wastewater treatment plants, you're right. I mean, most of the data points are green, which I assume means you're comfortable with their level of PFAS contamination in their effluent. But there are a decent number in yellow and a few in red. So could you tell me the quantitative benchmarks you use to determine green from yellow and yellow to red?
Yeah, so for that, we issued voluntary guidance in 2024, in summer of 2024, that recommended reduced rates of land application now that we were getting that monitoring data in. We said, if you're under 20 parts per billion, continue as usual. 20 to 50, we urge a reduced land application rate. Above 50, we urge a further reduced application rate. The bill that is being debated this year. I know we've provided some feedback on it. It's some tweaks, but sort of a similarly tiered approach. And so that's sort of the same framework that's applying to that green, yellow, orange, red color coding. The takeaway is that there are a couple, there's, I believe, 3 or 4 systems in the state that currently exceed the levels being discussed in legislation. The big red one that you see there is one that had very high levels, and while it still is permitted to land apply, it has chosen to stop land applying. And so there are a small universe of systems with these elevated levels that the legislation discussed this year would start to bring into play.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair Collison.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this very informative report. So speaking of wells, I was wondering 2 things. One, is there any program by which a well user would be able to ask for us, the state, to test their water, number 1? And number 2 is if they find something, if they find high levels of PFAS in their well water, is there any kind of mitigation program that's available to them at this time?
This has come up in certain counties, and to be clear, the way that the private well program works is that it's a delegated authority from MDE to the counties. So we work with the county health departments when those kinds of questions come in, and it frequently is subject to the availability of resources to conduct that testing. There have been efforts to test, and then if and when elevated levels are found, we provide our best advice and guidance, such as the short FAQ that we've developed on private wells to those residents. There is not a comprehensive mitigation program. There's not a dedicated funding source specifically for private wells. There's also testing available to private citizens. I have availed myself of this at my home in Cecil County, tested by water myself with a number of different types of test kits from different companies to get those results. And the costs for those have come down dramatically. This is also something that plumbers around the state have services that they can offer to do that testing and install treatment if it's necessary as well. But in terms of the state support for that, that's just a continuing conversation that we'd be very open to having with you, at any time.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Assistant Secretary, for your good presentation this morning. You've talked a lot about wastewater and biosolids and whatnot, and currently we've been having a massive spill in the Potomac. I know we have some Potomac people coming up shortly, but can you tell me what kind of testing is going on there that may affect finfish or shellfish, or just the affluent, what's coming into the river right now? So I know it's 400 or more million gallons.
Yeah, so MDE is tracking this very closely along with Region 3 and EPA, and it's a multi-jurisdictional effort. There has been I don't know if the ice has melted enough yet that we can get our teams out there into the Potomac to start doing that testing. I know that was one of the things we were unable to do last week simply because of the weather. But our intent is to be sampling the water quality in various places along that stretch of the river. In terms of your specific questions on impacts to certain fish species, I don't have that information in front of me right now, but I'm happy to get back to you.
Thank you. So is there any testing being done when it's coming out of the plant? Like
I would have to get to check with my team and get back to you on that. In terms of things like PFAS, the liquid effluent that flows through those pipes before it gets to the treatment plant have much lower concentrations of what ends up in the biosolids. The biosolids are the concentrated solid product of it. So, the levels in the liquid flowing through pipes like what ruptured is in the parts per trillion, as opposed to in the biosolids we're talking about parts per billion. While we of course don't want any contaminants to end up in any of our waterways, I think that this is something that the environment may be able to absorb on this very sort of limited basis.
Thank you.
And Delegate Jacobs, just for your benefit, the Public Utilities Subcommittee under Chair Foley's leadership is going to have a briefing, particularly on the rupture. It's obviously very important to me. It's also in Delegate Warman's district, so we stay on top of it.
Delegate Taveras.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you so much for this super important presentation. Well, maybe this is probably more in line when working with the Department of Health. Well, I'll say one comment. I think that in the collaboration is key piece. I think you're missing a critical stakeholder there, which is the industries in question, right? You can regulate at the government level all you want, but if you don't have the industry at the table cooperating with you to change their supply chains and their manufacturing production, you're still going up against the grain, right? With regards to looking at the contaminated sites, my question is, you could see the vast majority of where we are with regards to how folks are contaminated by their blood serum levels, whether it's at 50 percentile, which is basically like 5 parts per billion, or 8 parts per billion at 75, or 95% at 18 parts per billion, and that depends how close they are to these contaminated sites. So I do think that there needs to be something done where we're checking and having thematic mapping with regards to what the blood serum levels are of people, so we know, and then we could tell. So that's the question. Like, are you working on that issue and to assess that? And if we do, and if we're not, I do think that we can see or try to identify those areas.
Delegate Taveras, can you ask your question and let them answer?
Well, okay, I did ask the question. I'm just saying that, I'm just trying to ask.
You need to let them answer.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
Well, thank you very much, Delegate, for that question. So we do collaborate very closely with MDH on this. There is a multi-agency group that meets regularly to discuss coordination on PFAS issues, and the PFAS action plan that we developed based on the George Walter Taylor Act's direction from this chamber was co-developed by MDE and MDH with input from a variety of other agencies. And I can also just say that from my experience at the federal level, that the only way to make progress on PFAS is collaboration across departments of environment, agriculture, health, working with the medical professional community, working with defense and public safety entities. I know I will have to follow up about Maryland-focused blood serum data.
Yeah, these
so
are general, these are US data.
Yeah, I will follow up with MDH about that. I know that the CDC has done some blood serum testing and has some important data in that space.
And my only thing is that we've already seen decreases and declines in those blood serum levels in other areas and through 5-year cohorts. So I just think it's valuable because we can get there.
Yes, the proof is in that pudding in particular.
Thank you.
And we would ask if you can get that data, if you share it with both committees.
Yes.
Delegate Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned the best way to deal with PFAS at wastewater treatment plants is to identify the source. There are literally hundreds of thousands of sources for a wastewater treatment plant. How do you identify the source? How do you enforce it? And can you forward that data to us?
So that's a great question. Thank you, Delegate. So source trackdowns are things that wastewater treatment plants do regularly for other types of contaminants. The methods used vary based on what you're searching for, but you start with the biggest pipe and you get upstream. You find out where the sources are. You can also do some triaging of what you're looking at based on what you suspect certain types of industries are that may be using or discharging PFAS, even at times without even knowing that they are intentionally adding PFAS into the discharge system. So this is something that we've talked with wastewater systems, some of whom I know are represented in this room, who already have some good ideas of where their PFAS are coming from. And getting granular, again, this isn't about getting into everyone's home. This is about getting, toward, wow, there's a real spike coming from this pipe. Let's go and see where that's coming from. And, it's almost like, driving down a street and, turning down different roads to find, where is something coming from. And so this is pretty well trodden ground from an investigation perspective. It's just fully doing it for PFAS, in particular in these systems where we are seeing these very elevated levels of PFAS.
How do you enforce it, and can you send us the data?
How do we, sorry?
How do you enforce it? Like, once you've identified it, how do you enforce that?
So that's a great question. So the way to enforce it is through the Federal Clean Water Act pre-treatment program. That under the Clean Water Act, wastewater systems can establish local limits, which are specific to that water system, at which the wastewater authority can say, we have to meet this standard, this federal standard or state standard, and so we are going to hold you, a discharger into our system, accountable because the burden shouldn't be on the ratepayers. But to activate that authority, there needs to be some sort of limit in statute or regulation, and so that's what something like the biosolids limit that's being discussed this year would actually do. That's the hook, that's the legal backstop that's needed for wastewater systems to fully activate those pretreatment programs. In terms of the data, I'll have to get back to you on sort of what we have now and what's in the hands of the wastewater systems and share what we can of that with you.
Can you send us the chart that you had? Can you send us the sheet, the Excel sheet you had? Can you forward that to us?
The biosolids data? Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Delegate Ross, was your question answered?
Answered. The good delegate did ask the exact same question that I had, probably the first and maybe last time that will ever happen, but it's good. But I did have, so thank you. I did have a second question, though, if I can take advantage of it. Can you point me to state-specific or federal grants for people who have PFAS contamination? I did recently hear from a well owner about this, probably heard about the bill, and I'd like to be able to share that with that individual and anybody else who asks about it. Thank you.
I'd be happy to follow up with information.
Thank you.
And could you share that with our committees as well? Because I'm sure we all have constituents that would appreciate it.
Yes. And I do want to just be very clear, though, that there currently is not a federal or state funding program that is dedicated to or broadly eligible for people served by private wells, other than by connecting that private well to an existing wastewater treatment system or creating a new drinking water system or creating a new drinking water system.
Delegate Naraki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So our district, we happen to have 3 landfills inside of our district, 2 of which actually are sited right on the Gunpowder River. One is undergoing actually a significant expansion by Baltimore County right now. In addition, we also in that same area have a dredge spoils site as well. So I'd like to get your thoughts on how we address we know that there's a lot of material inside of these landfills. We know that some of these landfills are pretty old. There's been some discussion about them leaching leachate into the water. How do we address those materials that are inside of the landfill already? And what about dredge spoils? What do we know that could be in there? I presume it's soil just like anywhere else. I presume that there could be PFAS in that as well. So how do we address a site like that also?
Thank you, Delegate, and another great question. So with respect to landfills, landfills are identified as a potentially significant source of PFAS contamination. When I was still at EPA determined that they may warrant their own federal effluent limitation guideline, which is a national tool used under the Clean Water Act to set technology-based standards for how much of a certain substance an industry can discharge into the environment. Now, I don't see that actually going anywhere anytime soon, even under different circumstances. That standard would take many, many years to develop, but that's sort of the level of attention and concern. The only other sectors or industries that EPA had designated for that standard thus far were PFAS manufacturers, chrome and electroplaters, and I'm sorry, what's the third one? I'll think of it in a moment. But we are in Maryland doing a study of the 91 landfills that we permit here around the state. I'm not going to cover it here, but there's a slide toward the end of the presentation that should be in your hands with a bit of information about what we're doing there. We hope that the results will start rolling in this summer. This is a solvable problem too. Capture of PFAS at landfill leachate discharge points is something that many other states are starting to do. The technologies do exist, and those costs are coming down pretty dramatically as new types of treatment and concentration technologies are entering the market. Some landfills also take that leachate and discharge it into a wastewater treatment system. So it's also a conversation between the wastewater authorities and the landfills about how to address those kinds of discharges.
And then the dredge spoil sites?
The dredge spoil sites, I will have to talk to our team and get you some more information on that. I'm not fully up to speed on what we know in that respect here in Maryland.
So if you take the leachate to a wastewater treatment facility, I'm thinking about it in my case here in Baltimore County, it would go to the Back River wastewater treatment plant. Who has to pay then for that? Is that the landfill owner that's paying the additional cost? Because I've gone to the plant, I've toured, there's absolutely an additional cost depending upon what your levels you're trying to get at to remove PFAS from that, or is that like just the responsibility of the wastewater operator? Who pays?
Currently, nobody's paying for it. To install treatment there, it depends on if the wastewater authority is able to activate its local limits and pre-treatment authorities for that for that particular type of discharger. In which case, it would then be able to require that the cost be on the discharger to when it comes to they would have to pre-treat that effluent before it enters the system.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you to MDE. We appreciate having you. We're going to move on to the next panel, which includes the Potomac Riverkeeper Network, Maryland American Academy of Pediatrics, and Dr. Exum. And just a reminder for all my colleagues, we are being evicted from this room in 47 minutes. Please go ahead when one of you is ready.
How do I find my slides?
Do you want me to begin? Yeah, do you want to begin? Sure. Okay, sorry. Hi, everyone, Vice Chair, Chair, delegates. My name is Natalie Exum. I'm a professor of environmental health and engineering at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. It is a true honor to be with you today. I have a lot of hope that is instilled within me to be listening to this conversation today and your knowledge on this subject and how comprehensive your thinking is right now. And so as someone who does this for a living and is educating the next generation on these topics, I'm deeply hopeful today. And just to share that I also am part of a center called the CHARM Center. It's called the Community Health Addressing Regional Maryland of Environmental Determinants of Disease at Johns Hopkins. This center is hopefully relevant to you here today because we take intake. We take the model of academia and switch it on its head. We take community members' concerns. They come to us. They ask us to apply our research and our science to address issues that matter to them. And I can say to you here today, I have heard from a number of different constituents across Maryland who are very concerned about this, also in their drinking water, yes, but also in fish tissues and in other kind of exposure sources. So very encouraged today. In my advanced environmental health class, where we talk about this subject, one of the first kind of pieces of science that we rely on right now is a study that came out of the National Academies in 2022. And from that study came out one really important slide, which was how to think about this in our blood serum. What is the level? You mentioned that 50th percentile level. What level of blood serum are we going to start to be concerned about when we measure this? And I think we are moving to a world where if a farmer finds out that they have had biosolids applied to their farm where there is potentially known high concentrations of PFAS, that farmer may end up going to their clinician and saying, I need to measure this in my blood to see if I have been exposed. That is not happening right now, except in the state of Maine, where this issue has become so elevated now that it's actually part of recommended clinical care in the state of Maine if you're thought to have a known exposure. But I do see, as an environmental health scientist, I think we are moving toward a world where people will begin to test their blood and to say, am I somebody who needs to now think about where are my sources coming from? Am I eating my, backyard fish, and maybe that's my source, right? And I think we're moving to a world, it's getting into the consciousness of so many people that from a public health perspective, what you are doing here today to think about this for Maryland is going to make Marylanders safe for this generation, the next generation to come. I have so many more thoughts on this, but I really want to leave time for you all to ask questions because I know we're getting kicked out at 12:30. Thank you for having me, and I'll pass it on to the River Keepers.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Chairman, and everyone else here. My name is Brett Walls. I'm your Upper Potomac River Keeper and the Potomac Program Director for Potomac River Keeper Network. I've been in Maryland working on water quality issues for about 17 years, and I've worked with MDE for that same amount of time. And I would have to agree with Zach, Mr. Schaefer, that Maryland really is on the leading edge when it comes to PFAS. They're extremely progressive. We've had a great working relationship over the past years on addressing the sources of PFAS. And so in 2017 is when I first really started to investigate PFAS, collecting samples and assessing where these sources of PFAS are coming from. Yeah, and we focused early on the Antietam Creek in Washington County, where we knew from USGS biologists that the PFAS levels in smallmouth bass were at 500,000 parts per trillion. And we wanted to know why. And so we tested wastewater treatment plants, we tested the stream, we communicated that to MDE, and our goal was there to really press upon, we need to have fish consumption advisories for PFAS, because if it's there in the Antietam, relatively rural, but with some urban mix there, it's got to be in a lot of the other locations throughout the state. And therefore, MDE they did a concentrated effort of collecting samples, and they issued fish consumption advisories, probably one of the first states on the East Coast to do so. And then later on, we worked again with Maryland. We produced a map, visualized finally the biosolid locations across the state. And then we also produced other maps about the risk to soils based on water table. The response from Maryland is to produce a moratorium on no new permits for biosolids until they can figure that out. And that's exactly when Maryland and MDE went forward and started collecting more samples from wastewater treatment plants to really wrap their head around what needs to be done about biosolids, especially when it comes to PFAS. And over the years, we have concentrated our efforts in collecting samples, investigating PFAS and all the various different sources. We've focused on reaching out to the community, doing PFAS 101 presentations. We joined a group of other water keepers throughout the nation to test for PFAS in our rivers and streams. And one of the highlights of that process was noting that Piscataway Creek had one of the highest levels of PFAS in that study. Well, we're talking about 1,300 parts per trillion in Piscataway Creek, quite far downstream from Joint Base Andrews. And as you work upstream, we've noted in future sampling, you're around 2,000 to 3,000 parts per trillion. So significantly high levels in the flowing river of Piscataway Creek. And so we've been taking this tact of trying to really address PFAS and reaching out into the community as best we can. And one of those two projects have really come across in the last year. This is the Nominee Bay in Virginia, and then the Antietam PFAS project in Pennsylvania. These are both rural communities that have a lot of biosolids, but not a lot of other sources of PFAS. These are rural communities that are concerned about their well water. These are rural communities that need to know answers and get some education on how they can reduce their exposure to PFAS. And we have done that through sampling of various wells. And the question about wells, and what to do for citizens, it's extremely expensive. $400 a sample, so not something that the average homeowner really wants to spend for one particular test. But there's a company out there, I don't work for them, Cyclopure, $70 a test kit. It's what we use in all of our programs because it is such a low cost, but it gives you high quality results. And so just like what MDE talked about in really stopping at the source, we have taken a long time to identify all these various different sources throughout the Potomac watershed, not just Maryland, but Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And we focused on military bases, biosolids, wastewater treatment plants, landfills, and major airports. These are all the major sources of PFAS. Now, there are other smaller sources out there, but these are the big ones that we are trying to address in our two different campaigns. Stop the PFAS at the source, just like Maryland. We're looking at wastewater treatment plants and biosolids, looking upstream into the system. And we recognize that there's a lot of businesses in the upstream environment and that there is going to be some impact and some change, regrettably. But we're not against biosolids being used. We're just against the high levels of PFAS in biosolids. And so we really want to have a good cooperative agreement, and we've been working really well with Maryland and legislature in trying to produce bills and standards. And like you can see in the slide, over the years we've continuously come back and back and back. The second campaign is Clean Up Your Mess, which is really targeted on military bases. These are the epicenters of massive PFAS pollution issues. Now that takes a different tack to address, but one of the reasons why we went for the very first bill, the George Walter Taylor Act, was to address AFFF, which is a high level of PFAS, extremely high levels, especially at the military sites. And so over the years, we're going to come back. We're going to continue to come back, and you'll see this year a new bill for sewage sludge and PFAS and a product phase-out bill. And as we move and have been working in Maryland, we're starting to realize that we need to work in all the other different states because the Potomac is a shared river system. And so we're starting to move into Virginia and probably follow the same tact, looking at treatment, looking at fish consumption advisories, looking at limiting PFAS and biosolids. It's extremely important that we kind of follow the same method that we have done in Maryland. And especially given that 21% of the biosolids applied in Virginia are coming from Maryland, and then 14% are coming from DC. That's a significant amount of biosolids from another state that's going into another state, all being shared by the same river, the Potomac. And so the other thing that we have realized in communicating with the communities out there is this really misunderstanding of what is in biosolids. So the farmers don't know. They do not know what the levels of PFAS are in the biosolids. They do not know. They do not know the exposure pathways that are impacting either them or their farms or their neighbors' wells or anything. And so we feel that it is the farmer's right to know what's in the biosolids. And that's why we have really focused on biosolids. Here you have a picture of horses. These are my horses. This is my farm. I use hay to feed my horses. I have a lot of friends down the road that I get my hay from. And unbeknownst to them and unbeknownst to me, they have used biosolids on their farm fields over the years. And they did not know about PFAS until when we start striking up a conversation. I did not know that the pesticides and the herbicides that I put on my pastures to keep the weeds away also have a lot of PFAS in them. And so I have been directly exposed to those PFASs. So farms are business too. And they have a right to know what's in these various different products, whether it's off the shelf or whether it's coming from, biosolids in a wastewater treatment plant. And so there's this fear. There's this fear of if they do know, there's going to be liability on the products that they produce from their farm. They're going to get unwanted attention from the community, and we do not want that. We need to protect our farmers, but we also need to protect everyone else that is around these farms that are drinking water from these wells. And so that's why we really focused on PFAS exposure pathways, whether it's coming from biosolids, pesticides, herbicides, or well contamination. And my conversations all across not just Maryland, but also Virginia and in Pennsylvania, is people just do not know, and they're thirsty and they're hungry to know. They want to know how to protect their drinking water. They want to know how to test it. They want to know who's doing that. And the only thing I can do is educate them on how to do that and how to take care of it for themselves. There is a way to protect their drinking water in their home if they do have high levels of PFAS. And it is a relatively simple charcoal filter, a whole house filter, or even just at the sink wherever you get your water. So there are tools that communities can employ to protect themselves. You know, and then again, we get to the products that are off the shelf for residents. These are products that are being used in our gardens. These are products that are used on school grounds. These are products that are used on government spaces. These are products that do not have a listing of what kind of PFAS are in there or what the levels are. And the citizens, just like the farmers, have a right to know. And thank you very much. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Betsy Nicholas.
Thanks, Brent. Thank you, chairs and vice chairs and committee members from both the committees here. My name's Betsy Nicholas. I'm the president of Potomac Riverkeeper Network. You might have other questions you want to ask me, but I'm going to try and stick to PFAS here, and would be happy to talk about this bill at another time with anyone. So I just wanted to focus on a few things that I think are easily misunderstood on this issue on the whole. Wastewater treatment plants aren't making PFAS, right? They're an aggregator of it. It's coming in from a multitude of different sources, and that's sort of the center point at which we can stop it there before we start an entire cycle of contamination of PFAS in our drinking water systems, in our food, on our fields, getting downstream to shellfish and fish in the rivers, because that's where the exposure pathways start to quadruple and more when you are potentially getting exposed to PFAS in your drinking water at low levels, in your food because of packaging, in your products that are grown in the state because the cows that produce the milk were grazing on fields that have been treated with biosolids containing PFAS. And so as this moves along, we get more and more of it in our systems. It bioaccumulates like a lot of nasty toxic materials that we've dealt with over time, like PCBs. And so that means that when you're getting multiple exposure pathways like this, it's all accumulating in your body and causing numerous health problems. I also wanted to speak a little of the perspective of some of the constituents that Brent and our other riverkeepers have been working with, in particular farmers and watermen or seafood growers. These businesses also are not creating the PFAS. They are recipients of it, but more disturbing is that they're not even being told or warned about this potential impact. We know actually an oyster grower, he's technically in Virginia, but it's Potomac River, so it's Maryland waters, who bought up all the fields around his oyster growing so that he could ensure that biosolids are not being applied there. That's how concerned these industries are about this, and we need to be thinking about them as businesses along with everyone else we're thinking about. Farmers, as we've gotten to know them and start talking to them about this issue, are feeling like they have been lied to, that they have been assured that using biosolids as a cheap fertilizer was safe. And now they're finding out that they were perhaps inadvertently allowing toxic material to contaminate their farm. So as has been mentioned by multiple people, there is legislation coming on this. And one thing I wanted to point out that was relevant to a few questions I heard before is there's also a PFAS fund that is being established in the legislation to help try to address some of these victims of this big societal toxic contamination problem. Maryland is suing the big industries who started this in the first place, and I would say good job. They should pay for the mess and the harm that they've caused, and those would be the first big boost of money into this PFAS fund, is when there's a claim from that can go and help farmers or well owners or others. So wanted to make sure you were aware of that. And the other thing I wanted to circle back on is something that Mr. Schaefer from MDE talked about. And this is an extrapolation of one of the sources. So just say milk that had PFAS contamination at the level here. That's how many 280 new cases of cancer in Maryland we would be getting off of just one. But for people who are exposed through fish, milk, what they're eating, their drinking water, it goes up by orders of magnitude as we go along with that. And so we want to make sure that we keep in mind protecting the public, protecting communities, protecting downstream businesses. And thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, and we'd be happy to answer questions as well as supply additional information to the committees.
I'll be going next. I'm Dr. Michael Ichniowski. I'm a retired pediatrician, but I serve as the chairperson for the Environmental Health and Climate Change Committee for the Maryland chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'll limit my remarks today to the health effects of PFAS chemicals that have been discovered and published in the medical literature. You've had an excellent overview of PFAS from the Department of Environment. As they stated, there are nearly 15,000 different chemicals identified as PFAS, and most of the research has only been done on a very, very small percentage of these chemicals. The conditions that have been associated with PFAS exposures include immunotoxicity, elevated total and LDL cholesterol, thyroid dysfunction, liver toxicity, renal disease, decreased birth weight, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and kidney and testicular cancer. One form of immune suppression is a diminished response to vaccines. This has been found in both children who can get PFAS across the placenta from their mothers before birth, and can also be exposed to PFAS, which gets excreted in breast milk. Decreased antibodies have also been demonstrated in children from exposures in childhood at 5 and 7 years of age, and also in adults to certain vaccines. Prenatal exposures to PFAS have also been associated with an increased susceptibility to infectious diseases in children and an increased risk of hospitalization from upper and lower respiratory tract infections. PFOS, PFOA, and total PFAS levels demonstrated increased risk of COVID-19 infections, and elevated levels of one form PFBA, which is a shorter chain PFAS that accumulates in the lung tissue, was associated with an increased severity of COVID-19 infections, as well as a greater risk of prolonged hospitalization and need for intensive care and death. A number of studies have indicated that PFAS exposures result in increased total and low density LDL, or the so-called bad cholesterol levels in both adults and children. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine has concluded there is sufficient evidence of an association between PFAS exposure and increased cholesterol levels. Altered thyroid function and hormone levels have been associated with PFAS exposures. Data from the NHANES survey, which is a National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is a national survey that has been conducted for several decades now that follows the levels of PFAS and a number of other chemicals in a sample of the entire U.S. population. So it's a good source of information as to what's going on where and how it's tracking over time. The National Academy has said that there is sufficient evidence of an association between PFAS exposure and increased cholesterol. With thyroid, PFAS can interact with the thyroid binding proteins and disrupt the feedback between free thyroid hormone and the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis that regulates the thyroid hormone levels in the blood. Serum levels of a number of PFAS were higher among newborns with congenital hypothyroidism, and a meta-analysis demonstrated a negative association between the total T4 levels and blood levels of certain PFAS chemicals. That is, lower T4 levels in association with higher PFAS levels. Accumulation of long-chain PFAS occurs in the liver, and exposure to these chemicals have been associated with elevated liver enzymes in adults and adolescents, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, in which excess lipid accumulates in hepatocytes or liver cells, is associated comorbid condition with hyperlipidemia. The kidney is another organ where PFAS can concentrate, and the prolonged half-lives of long-chain PFAS have been attributed to active reabsorption by renal tubules. PFAS exposure has been associated with decreased glomerular filtration and chronic kidney disease in adults and children, as well as elevated levels of uric acid, which is an indicator for increased risk of kidney disease. PFAS exposures have been associated with adverse perinatal effects. Several PFAS have been linked to an increased risk of pregnancy-induced hypertension and preeclampsia. PFAS can cross the placenta, and association between elevated PFAS and decreased birth weight has been demonstrated in several studies. In 2014, the International Agency for Research on Cancer listed PFOA as possibly carcinogenic to humans based on increased risk of renal and testicular cancers in exposed groups. This same group determined that tetrafluoroethylene, the building block of polytetrafluoroethylene, or Teflon, used in nonstick surface, was probably carcinogenic to humans. In the decades since that report, additional research has confirmed the risk of renal cancer from PFOA, identified an increased risk of testicular cancer from PFOS, and increased risk of thyroid cancer was associated with PFOS, PFNA, PFOPA, and PFHXS in a longitudinal study. Another study evaluating PFAS levels above the maximum contaminant level in drinking water found positive associations between the maximum contaminant level violations and leukemia, and also cancers of the brain, urinary system, and soft tissue in males, and endocrine cancer, oropharyngeal cancer, and soft tissue cancer in females. So the health impacts of PFAS remains an area of active research and continued study. The National Academy has developed a PFAS clinical scale based on measurements of 9 different PFAS in the blood that creates a risk profile based on the sum of these chemicals. And the scales, if your blood level should fall at the 75th percentile or above, it recommends increased risk of health problems from PFAS exposure. At the 95th percentile is the highest risk of health effects from PFAS exposure with this summed measure of PFAS chemicals. Be happy to answer any questions at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, because of the time, we're going to have to forego the questions on this panel, but our council can facilitate follow-ups in writing. I know at least some members had their lights up for questions. We're going to move on to our wastewater and biosolids panel, and thank you all for being here. Sorry, we're in a little bit of a rush. We can bring up MEMWA, WSSC, DC Water, and the City of Baltimore Department of Public Works.
Good morning, committee chairs, vice chairs, and committee members. My name is Rosalind Sweeney, and I'm here on behalf of the Maryland Association of Municipal Wastewater Agencies, or MAMWA, which is an association of counties and municipalities that own wastewater treatment plants, as well as the leading environmental engineering firms that help those plants work for clean water across the state. I'd like to thank the committees for scheduling this briefing on a topic of critical importance to the state's wastewater plants. As WSSC Water will share shortly, wastewater plants are already paying to conduct PFAS sampling monitoring and identify potential PFAS sources. Fortunately, the plants have been able to find partners to provide grants and other funding to support those efforts. In contrast, any restrictions on biosolids land application would mean a tenfold increase in costs. Local utilities will have no partners to bear those costs. They will all be borne by our customers and your constituents. We welcome the opportunity to participate in discussions on how best to balance PFAS reductions with affordability concerns. MAMWA's goal is to ensure that we consider the financial feasibility of alternatives if there are land application restrictions on biosolids, to give wastewater treatment plants enough time to tackle this challenge, and to provide adequate financial resources to meet any new requirements. Wastewater plants do not create PFAS. Our customers and your constituents should not be asked to bear the full burden of solving this statewide issue. Several MAMWA members are here today to provide a briefing to you and to help answer any questions. They are technical experts in the field. Joining me today are Laura O'Donnell from WSSC Water, Mike Hallman from the City of Baltimore, Chris Piott and Zach Borenpole from DC Water. Also in the room is Monica Marquina, the Director of Governmental Affairs for WSSC Water. We have slides to present that have been prepared by WSSC Water, Baltimore City, and DC Water. And I'll now turn the microphone over to Laura O'Donnell to share some of the work that WSSC Water has done to reduce the level of PFAS, both in its effluent and in its biosolid. Thank you.
Good afternoon, chairs, vice chairs, and distinguished members. My name is Laura O'Donnell, and I serve as the PFAS Program Manager for WSSC Water. It is an honor to be here today to discuss the complex issue of PFAS in wastewater and biosolids. WSSC Water is a water and wastewater utility that serves 1.9 million people in Montgomery and Prince George's counties. In my role, I oversee compliance with PFAS regulations on both drinking water and wastewater, working alongside a very talented and driven team of scientists, engineers, and other staff who are dedicated to protecting public health. My objective today is to share how WSSC Water prioritizes public health by proactively initiating projects to reduce PFAS, and how we prioritize affordability for our ratepayers by focusing on lowest cost, highest return PFAS reduction approaches. As a water and wastewater utility, it is critical that we understand PFAS concentrations throughout our system and work to reduce them. We are proud to say that in 2025, we collected over 400 samples in our water and wastewater system. We also invested $1.5 million to set up an advanced PFAS laboratory, which will allow us to analyze for PFAS in drinking water, wastewater, and biosolids, and serve as a regional resource. WSSC collects 185 million gallons of wastewater a day from homes, industries, and businesses. PFAS, like many contaminants, originates at the source and disperses throughout the environment. When we say source, we are referring to the manufacturing processes, industrial applications, and use of consumer products. As PFAS continues to be used, they will continue to appear in our wastewater and biosolids. As protectors of public health, WSSC Water is committed to reducing PFAS concentrations within our wastewater system. But that requires a holistic PFAS reduction strategy that starts at the source and takes time and resources to implement, as shown on this slide. As Zach mentioned in his earlier discussion, we must get upstream, and that means we must stop PFAS at the source. This is the most cost-effective approach. Eliminating PFAS use upstream permanently reduces PFAS in multiple media, including wastewater and biosolids, and it shifts the responsibility from our ratepayers and customers to the producers. As we move down on this slide, the next in line is reducing PFAS through pretreatment, as you've heard before. before it is discharged to our sewers. This is consistent again with MDE's statement to hold our polluters accountable. Once PFAS enters the sewer system, removal becomes far more expensive. Pre-treatment costs would fall on the industrial users who are discharging PFAS into our system rather than our customers. This approach works pre-treatment. Other states like Michigan have successfully reduced PFAS through strategic pre-treatment. However, it takes time to implement effectively. WSSC Water has already collected extensive samples in both our industrial and non-industrial discharges to understand PFAS levels. We have identified major PFAS inputs like local landfills and runoff from military bases. We are now working closely with MDE to identify pretreatment options, regulatory authority, and funding for mitigation projects. Stepping down the slide, in this multi-barrier strategy, we continue to actively explore innovative technologies to treat the PFAS we do receive at our facilities. We are currently leading and partnering in over $7 million of PFAS research projects, and nearly all of that is grant funded at no cost to our customers. WSSC Water's PFAS research has focused on promising technologies that capture PFAS, then treat, which enables us to have a smaller treatment footprint while still retaining the agricultural and revenue benefits of biosolids. We expect this to be more effective and less costly than high temperature pyrolysis or incineration of biosolids. In closing, PFAS is a complex challenge that requires time, resources, and collaboration. The most important and effective step is stopping PFAS at its source. Pre-treatment strategies are essential, but it requires clear pre-treatment authority and takes time to implement effectively. At WSSC Water, we remain committed to protecting public health and minimizing costs for our customers by focusing on source reduction, strategic pre-treatment, and innovative research. We appreciate the leadership of these committees and MDE, and we look forward to continuing to work with you all on a solution that safeguards our environment and communities. Thank you.
I think I just want to note as the rest of the speakers go, it's 12:18 and we're getting evicted from here at 12:30, so appreciate it.
I think I'm up. My name's Chris Piot. I am the Director of Resource Recovery for DC Water. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I also wanted to thank Zach for his presentation and MDE for their collaborative approach to this very complex issue. I've worked on these types of things in other states, and I can tell you it's not always this collaborative, so thank you. Really appreciate it. I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of biosolids. I work at Blue Plains, which is the world's largest advanced wastewater treatment plant. And Blue Plains is designed to keep the carbon and the nutrients out of the Chesapeake Bay because out there they're considered to be pollutants. But carbon is energy and nutrients are fertilizers. So we designed a system to extract this valuable resource. We treat it like an asset rather than a waste. So we collect the solids, we put them through our thermal hydrolysis system. It's high heat, high pressure system, and then it goes into digesters where we convert about half the solids into gas, which we use to generate renewable electricity and steam. Very important for us because we run about a third of our enormous plant off of this renewable electricity. And then we use the steam to heat up the thermal hydrolysis system, so we don't need any external energy to do that. It's very, very energy efficient. I'm an engineer, I'm super proud of it. And then what is left in the bottom of the digesters we extract out, and this remaining material we squeeze the water out of it, and that is our Class A exceptional quality biosolids by EPA standards. We gain that designation because of the high heat, high pressure system that we use, and because we get that designation, we can then sell it to the public. So we've branded it as Bloom, and Bloom is used as a slow release fertilizer and a soil amendment with benefits comparable to compost. The organic matter and the beneficial microbes in the biosolids improve soil health. Biosolids supply essential macro and micronutrients, some of those that you don't get with conventional fertilizers. It enhances soil disease resistance, increases plant drought resistance, which is a fascinating study we did with Virginia Tech. I'd love to talk to you about it some other time because we don't have time. And it also improves crop yields. We've got some farmer testimonials on the slide up here. We've got dozens more Farmers love the product, and it is in high demand. But we're here to talk about PFAS. So municipal biosolids, such as Bloom, can contain small concentrations of PFAS. If there is an industrial component to the wastewater treatment system, it can contain higher concentrations. What we want to do is make this distinction between municipal and industrially impacted biosolids. And for us, you know, we know that only about a very small percentage of our flow, I think it's 4% of our flow comes from industry. So we went upstream into our sewers and tested and found out that 95% of the mass of the PFAS is coming from our residential areas. So I agree, source control is really important, especially on an industrial impact side, but we're going to have to change behavior of our residents and our users if we're going to make a difference in what we have in our biosolids, which really is sort of a societal background level, similar to what we already have in our bloodstream. There's a graph up there that shows that we've reduced it, we've talked about it already, eliminated PFAS from Teflon, and everybody's PFOS levels have dropped over the last 20 years. We've been testing and monitoring PFAS since 2019, long before it was required, because we were as concerned as anybody about this. We wanted to make sure that what we had in our Bloom wasn't going to be causing any problems. We've done collaborative research with the University of Arizona and Virginia Tech. Dr. Ian Pepper did this national study looking at migration of PFAS compounds through the soil column, showing that it does not migrate down to wells. I can share that study with you if you'd like. So what are the options that we have? We've talked about it. Land application with its proven benefits provides significant value to farmers. Landfilling, you know, Virginia and Maryland both face landfill limit capacities. I think that's delegate over here was mentioning about landfills. And then there's also the issue of the leachate coming down and concentrating the PFAS, and that comes back to us at our treatment plant, and then it gets concentrated even more, so that's not a great solution. And then there's incineration, which requires very, very high capital. You know, we think that it would cost us at least $200 million to build one, and we don't think we could probably even build it in DC because of our air permits and environmental justice concerns. So restricting or eliminating land application would increase our annual operating budget to probably about $30 million a year, and this would place a significant financial burden on our customers for the small amount of PFAS that we have. Yeah, all right, thank you. So I think the solution is source control. I have lots to say about that, but I'm going to pass it to Mike because we don't have very much time.
All right. Very good. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Hallman. I'm the Deputy Bureau Head for Water and Wastewater for the City of Baltimore. Here in the first slide, it just gives just an overview of one of the scale of the operation for the City of Baltimore's wastewater treatment plants, but also, much like my partner utilities here, a lot of the ongoing efforts we are in terms of tackling this particular problem. But if I could leave you with one message today, it's this. Any additional costs the wastewater treatment plants bear to address PFAS in biosolids will be passed along to our ratepayers. The City of Baltimore will be particularly hit hard financially if financial impacts are not considered. As you know, Baltimore owns two of the largest treatment plants in the state of Maryland, both Back River and Patapsco, and we do service Baltimore County and, to a lesser part, Anne Arundel and Howard counties in there, so they would be likewise impacted. If the city cannot land apply our biosolids, we would either need to landfill 100% of our biosolids or install additional treatment at both plants. The city estimates it would cost approximately $50 million to landfill our biosolids, assuming we would find adequate landfill capacity for these materials. I would like to note here that Maryland has little to no landfill capacity for biosolids, so the city would need to ship those to other states, such as Virginia, who is estimating that it will run out of landfill capacity within the next 2 years. Installing treatment at both plants is even trickier and far more expensive. Unfortunately, there are a limited number of options in the market right now to treat biosolids for PFAS. The only mature technologies are incineration or pyrolysis or gasification. If the city could install pyrolysis or gasification technology, and that's a big if given the size of the operations at both of those plants, the city estimates it would cost nearly $650 million alone for Back River and an additional $300 million for Patapsco. That nearly $1 billion investment would have to be recuperated through our wastewater utility bills from the city's citizens and its businesses. That would be an extraordinary burden for our citizens who are already struggling with increasing home, grocery, and health care costs. On behalf of MAMWA, WSSC Water, DC Water, and the city, thank you again for the opportunity to share our views today.
We have a few minutes, so we'll let Delegate Boyce ask her question.
Thank you, and thank you so much. Biosolids is such a, and PFAS, such an interesting conversation. Mr. Hallman, I'm slightly disappointed. I hear what you're saying about what the cost could be, but what we didn't hear, what we heard from other folks, is what you're actually doing with this and the work that you're doing to actually remove PFAS from the biosolids and your processes for getting rid of PFAS generally. And I would have loved to learn more about that than what this is going to do to you, which I hear you and I certainly respect, but I would love to have heard more about the city's processes as it's working to remove PFAS from the wastewater treatments. Thank you.
Absolutely. I only kept it short just because of time constraints. It's in our first slide there, much like our partner utilities here with WSSC Water and DC Water. We have a very aggressive source tracking program to look into our significant industrial users, but also expanding out into those that don't necessarily fall under that umbrella and really addressing those. The biggest hurdle in that aspect would really be time in defining the size of the problem at each one of those particular entities, and then putting in appropriate mitigation plans, and then time in being able to see the results of all of those efforts, what we're receiving there at the treatment plants. So really just that continued effort. The source tracking is absolutely the key process in order to mitigate these sorts of impacts.
Thank you very much to both of our committees. Thank you to our panelists. It's complicated. We understand that, but I think there is a desire to see some sense of urgency. I think that was the sense that we were getting. So we appreciate continuing these conversations. I know that we are time limited today, so thank you very much to Mr. Chair and Madam Vice Chair for inviting us to partner with you on this, and thank you to Madam Vice Chair and our committee. This concludes the briefing on PFAS with the Environment and Transportation and the Health Committees.